The sun was rising over Alexandria. Inside the royal palace, Cleopatra 7 knew that her world was collapsing. Rome was coming for Egypt. Beyond the palace walls, Roman forces were closing in. The most powerful empire in the Mediterranean was about to decide the fate of Egypt. Inside the palace, Cleopatra was surrounded by wealth that had taken generations to build. But gold could not stop an army. But Cleopatra was not fighting only for herself. Her children were part of the future she was desperately trying to protect. The man threatening Cleopatra was Octavian. Young, disciplined, and ambitious, he had defeated her forces and now stood at the gates of Egypt. And there was another man whose fate was tied to hers. Mark Antony, once one of Rome's most powerful commanders, he was now fighting for survival beside Egypt's queen. Egypt had survived wars, dynasties, and foreign rulers, but now its independence depended on one queen's final decisions. Cleopatra had not always been trapped. She had once controlled her own destiny. To understand her final days, we must return to the beginning. Years earlier, Cleopatra was not a defeated queen hiding behind palace walls. She was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to keep Egypt independent, facing death inside her own palace. To understand that final moment, we must go back to the beginning of Cleopatra's extraordinary story. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC into a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for generations. She was born into enormous wealth, but also into a family where power could be deadly. Cleopatra belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded centuries earlier by Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. Their kingdom was Greek in origin, but the Ptolemaic royal family was not a peaceful family. Rivalry, political alliances, and struggles for the throne were part of royal life. Her father, Ptolemy XII, ruled Egypt during a difficult period. Rome's influence over Egypt was growing, and the royal family increasingly depended on Roman power. When Ptolemy XII was driven from Egypt, Rome helped restore him to his throne. Cleopatra was growing up in a world where Egyptian independence increasingly depended on Roman politics. In 51 BC, Ptolemy XII died. Cleopatra inherited the throne while still a teenager, becoming co-ruler of Egypt alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. On paper, Cleopatra and her brother ruled together. In reality, the partnership quickly became a struggle for control. But Cleopatra's enemies moved first. Her political opponents forced her from Alexandria, and the queen suddenly found herself fighting to regain the throne. Cleopatra had lost her throne in practice, but she had not surrendered her claim to it. And then, from across the Mediterranean, a Roman commander arrived in Alexandria. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. He had come to settle the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, but the Roman commander was about to become deeply involved in Egypt's royal struggle. Caesar summoned both sides of the royal family. Cleopatra was expected to appear before him, but she was not in Alexandria. She was outside the city and needed a way back in. Cleopatra knew that approaching Caesar openly could be dangerous. Her enemies controlled Alexandria, so she chose a far more daring way to reach him. Ancient accounts tell of Cleopatra being secretly brought into Caesar's presence, concealed inside a bundle of bedding or carpet. Whether every detail of the famous story is exact, its message is clear. Cleopatra took an enormous risk. Caesar decided to hear Cleopatra's claim, but her brother's supporters would not accept the decision. The political dispute was about to become a war. Fighting erupted in Alexandria. Caesar's forces were suddenly surrounded, while the conflict between Cleopatra and her brother became a full-scale struggle for the Egyptian throne. The fighting spread through Alexandria. Fires burned near the harbor, and the famous city was caught in the middle of a Roman civil war. Eventually, Caesar's forces prevailed. Ptolemy XIII was defeated, and Cleopatra's position became stronger than it had been before. Cleopatra had survived. She had regained her throne, but her alliance with Caesar would create a new chapter in her life. and give her a son whose existence would one day matter enormously. In 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but history would remember him as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra presented Caesarion as Caesar's son, but Caesar never publicly made him his official heir. Instead, Caesar's chosen heir was another young man, Octavian. Cleopatra eventually traveled to Rome with Caesarion. She wanted Caesar to recognize their relationship and strengthen Egypt's position. Cleopatra stayed near Caesar in Rome. Her presence attracted attention, admiration, and hostility. Some Romans were uncomfortable with Cleopatra's influence over Caesar. They feared that Rome's leader was becoming too close to a foreign queen. Then, on March 15, 44 BC, everything changed. Caesar entered the Senate. He would never leave alive. Cleopatra was in Rome when news of Caesar's assassination reached her. The man who had protected her position was dead. Cleopatra had little reason to remain in Rome. She gathered her son and supporters and returned to Egypt. When Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, she faced a new reality. Caesar was gone, Rome was unstable, and Egypt once again stood alone. Cleopatra had survived another political crisis, but she did not know that a new struggle was already beginning in Rome. Three men were rising: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus soon. Caesar was dead. Rome was no longer controlled by one man. Instead, a dangerous struggle for power was beginning. One of the men standing closest to Caesar was Mark Antony. He was a soldier, politician, and powerful commander, and he had no intention of surrendering Caesar's legacy. But Antony had a dangerous rival. Caesar's young adopted heir, Octavian, was beginning his own climb toward power. Antony had Caesar's military reputation. Octavian had Caesar's name and inheritance. Their alliance would not last forever. For a time, Antony and Octavian joined forces with Lepidus. Together, they formed a powerful political alliance known as the Second Triumvirate. Their greatest enemies were Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. The two sides prepared for a confrontation that would decide who controlled Rome. At Philippi, Antony and Octavian defeated the forces of Brutus and Cassius. Caesar's assassins were gone. Rome now belonged to the men who survived. After Philippi, Antony turned toward the wealthy eastern provinces. There, far from Rome, he would encounter the Queen of Egypt. Antony wanted Cleopatra to explain her actions during the recent civil war. He summoned her to meet him at Tarsus. Cleopatra decided that she would not arrive like an ordinary defendant. Cleopatra sailed toward Tarsus aboard a magnificent royal vessel. She knew that her first meeting with Antony could determine the future of Egypt. In 41 BC, Cleopatra arrived at Tarsus. Antony had summoned her to explain herself, but Cleopatra had no intention of arriving as a defeated queen. Antony had expected a straightforward political meeting. Instead, he found himself watching an elaborate royal spectacle unfold before him. Ancient writers described Cleopatra's arrival as extraordinary. Music played, incense filled the air, and the queen presented herself not as a defendant, but as a ruler. When Cleopatra finally met Antony, the balance of power was already shifting. She understood politics. Antony understood military power. Cleopatra needed Roman protection. Antony needed Egypt's wealth, resources, and political support. Their interests were beginning to align. Antony eventually followed Cleopatra to Alexandria. There, the Roman commander entered a world unlike anything he had known in Rome. For a time, Cleopatra and Antony lived in Alexandria, surrounded by luxury, culture, and political power. But beneath the celebrations, Rome was still watching. Cleopatra and Antony eventually had children together. Their family was becoming more than a private household. It was becoming part of their political future. Their power reached its height several years later. In Alexandria, Antony publicly granted territories and royal titles to Cleopatra and their children. Rome would not forget what happened. Antony and Cleopatra now looked almost unstoppable. But in Rome, Octavian was watching. and he understood something dangerous. If Antony and Cleopatra remained united, while Cleopatra and Antony enjoyed their power in Alexandria, Rome was watching. Every decision Antony made in the East was being examined by his enemies. Antony was supposed to be one of Rome's great leaders, but increasingly, he appeared to be building his future in Alexandria instead of Rome. Octavian understood that attacking Antony directly might not be enough. Instead, he increasingly focused attention on the foreign queen beside him. Cleopatra was more than Egypt's queen. To Octavian's political strategy, she could be portrayed as a foreign monarch interfering in Roman affairs. Then came one of the most politically explosive moments. Octavian obtained Antony's will and used its content to strengthen the case against him. Octavian presented Antony's actions as evidence that Rome itself was being threatened. Antony was no longer simply a rival. He was becoming a symbol of everything Octavian wanted Romans to fear. News of Rome's hostility eventually reached Antony. The alliance between the two men was breaking apart, and neither man trusted the other anymore. Rome and Alexandria were now moving toward confrontation. Antony and Cleopatra began preparing for the possibility that diplomacy would fail. In 32 BC, the political conflict crossed a dangerous line. Antony's supporters and Octavian's supporters were now openly preparing for war. The words were over. Diplomacy had failed. Now Rome and Egypt began assembling fleets and armies for the confrontation that would decide their future. By 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra had assembled a powerful fleet. Their ships gathered along the western coast of Greece, waiting for the confrontation with Octavian. Antony still commanded a large army, but size alone would not guarantee victory. Across the water, Octavian's forces were preparing their own strategy. Cleopatra was not simply watching from the sidelines. Egypt had supplied ships, money, and resources for the campaign. Her own kingdom's future was now tied to Antony's victory. Octavian's forces were smaller in some respects, but he had an advantage that would prove crucial: his commander, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Before the main battle, Agrippa had already begun attacking Antony's supply routes and coastal positions. The pressure was slowly increasing. As the campaign dragged on, Antony's position became increasingly difficult. Food was scarce, disease spread through the camps, and morale began to weaken. Across the narrow waters, the opposing forces could see each other. Thousands of men were waiting. Neither side knew exactly how the final battle would unfold. The night before the battle, the camps became strangely quiet. Soldiers prepared their weapons. Officers gave final orders. And Cleopatra knew that the future of Egypt might be decided by sunrise. Before the battle, Cleopatra and Antony faced the possibility that everything they had built could disappear. Their kingdoms. Then came the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC. The sun rose over the Ionian Sea. Hundreds of ships began moving into position. The battle of action was about to begin. On September 2nd, 31 BC, the two fleets finally moved against each other. The battle of action had begun. Antony's fleet contained some enormous ships. They were powerful floating fortresses, carrying soldiers, weapons, and heavy equipment. But their size could also become a weakness. Octavian's commander, Agrippa, understood the problem. Instead of fighting Antony's massive ships head-on, his forces relied on maneuverability and coordination. Then the distance between the fleets disappeared. Ships crashed together. Soldiers climbed across decks. The sea became a battlefield. Behind the main fighting, Cleopatra watched the battle from her position with the Egyptian fleet. She was not simply observing a battle. She was watching the fate of her kingdom unfold. Antony's forces struggled to break through the Roman formation. The battle was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Then, unexpectedly, an opening appeared. Antony's ships began moving toward a gap in the Roman formation. Suddenly, Cleopatra's ships moved through the opening. Her fleet sailed away from the main battle. Antony followed. Antony abandoned the main battle and followed Cleopatra. The decision would become one of the most controversial moments of his life. By the end of the battle, Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra had escaped, but their military power had been shattered. The road back to Egypt had begun. and their enemies would soon follow. After action, Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria. They had survived the battle, but they knew something had changed. The power they once possessed was disappearing. Surprisingly, Cleopatra and Antony did not immediately surrender to despair. They returned to royal life, holding celebrations and trying to maintain the appearance of confidence. But outside the palace, Egypt's political situation was deteriorating. Rome's victory had made Octavian the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. Antony still had soldiers, but loyalty was beginning to disappear. Some of his commanders and troops were no longer willing to continue the fight. Octavian did not stop at victory. He wanted the final prize, Egypt itself. His army moved toward Alexandria. Cleopatra knew that the final confrontation was approaching. She began making plans for the defense of Alexandria and for what might happen if the city fell. Antony prepared what remained of his forces, but the situation was becoming almost impossible. The enemy was approaching, and his own troops could no longer guarantee victory. Then Octavian's forces reached Alexandria. The final battle was no longer somewhere far away. It was at Cleopatra's doorstep. Antony made one final attempt to resist, but his remaining forces could not stop Octavian's advance. The end was approaching. Antony was defeated. Cleopatra's kingdom was surrounded, and inside the palace, the queen faced a question she had been trying to avoid. What would happen when Octavian finally came for her? In the final days of Alexandria, Antony received devastating news that he was told that Cleopatra was dead. Believing the woman he loved was gone, Antony made a decision that would end his own life. Antony believed there was nothing left for him, so he ordered his attendants to leave him alone. The Roman commander who had once commanded enormous armies now faced his final moment. But Cleopatra was not dead. She was hiding inside her fortified mausoleum. When Antony learned the truth, it was already too late. Cleopatra sent for Antony, wounded and near death. He was carried toward her, but the doors of the mausoleum were sealed. Antony and Cleopatra finally saw each other one last time. There was no army left commander and no empire left to conquer. Only two people facing the end of their world. Antony died soon afterward. The man who had once stood among Rome's most powerful leaders was gone. Cleopatra was now alone. Octavian had won the war, but Cleopatra was still valuable to him. He wanted her alive. She could be displayed in Rome as proof of his victory. Cleopatra was eventually brought before Octavian. She knew what he wanted, that he wanted her surrender. She wanted to protect what remained of her dignity and her children's future. Cleopatra soon understood that Octavian intended to take her to Rome. She would be displayed as a conquered queen. But Cleopatra had spent her entire life fighting to control her own fate. On the morning of August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra prepared herself for the final day of her life. She dressed as a queen. She entered her mausoleum, and before the day was over, one of the most famous women in ancient history would be dead. On August 12, 30 BC, Cleopatra entered her mausoleum. Outside, Roman soldiers guarded the building. Inside, the last queen of Ptolemaic Egypt prepared to die. But there's a problem with the famous story. Ancient writers themselves were not completely certain. Some described a snake, others suggested poison, and some accounts left the exact method unclear. One possibility is that Cleopatra used poison instead. Ancient people knew about many toxic substances, that a carefully prepared poison could have offered a more controlled method than a snake bite. The ancient sources were written after Cleopatra's death, and their accounts differ. That means historians cannot prove every detail of her final moments. When Octavian's men discovered Cleopatra, she was already dead. The queen he had wanted alive was gone. Rome had won Egypt. But Cleopatra had denied Octavian the final victory he wanted. Cleopatra's death did not end the bloodshed. Her son Caesar was still alive, though he was the son of Julius Caesar, and potentially a rival to Octavian. Caesar was captured and killed soon afterward. With Cleopatra dead, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end. Egypt was no longer an independent kingdom. Cleopatra died more than 2,000 years ago. Her kingdom disappeared, her dynasty ended, and Rome took control of Egypt. But Cleopatra herself never disappeared from history. She became a queen remembered across centuries, a politician, a survivor, a mother, a ruler, and one of the most fascinating women the ancient world ever produced. Her final days remain surrounded by mystery, and perhaps that is why, more than 2,000 years later, we are still asking the same question: how did Cleopatra really die? Cleopatra's story was not simply the story of a beautiful queen. It was a story of power, politics, war, love, betrayal, and survival. She ruled one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world and stood against Rome at the moment when the Roman Republic was becoming something entirely different. In the end, Rome won, Egypt fell, and Cleopatra died, but the mystery surrounding her final moment survived. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not how Cleopatra died, but why the world has never stopped remembering her. If you enjoyed this journey into ancient history, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for our next story from the ancient world. Until then, history never truly dies. It waits to be discovered.